Out of the many components that make up shonen anime, I think it's fair to say that one of the most popular aspects of them are the action scenes and fights. So, naturally, a writer will often focus and develop ideas that facilitate writing with or around that concept. When constructing the framework for a battle-centered shonen anime, or any action-focused fiction for that matter, one of the considerations the author has to make is the implementation and introduction of a power system. In essence, a power system is a basic rule set which defines, explains, and limits the offensive, defensive, and supportive actions and interactions any given character can perform in combative and sometimes non-combative situations. This definition might seem a bit technical and confusing at first, but I am sure you all know of some power systems yourself. The Last Airbender, Harry Potter, even Star Wars, technically. But if you want a really close example, then follow me on a little mental experiment. Let's say you go out late at night and you, being the upstanding member of society that you are, want to beat the shit out of someone. So, what is there to consider before engaging? Well, firstly, who is more jacked? Whether conscious or subconscious, a comparison of your visible muscle mass versus his will give you an understanding of how your chances are. Also, do you know karate or kung fu? How likely is it that he knows a counter to those? Secondly, is it a fist fight or is he packing a knife or some heat? And thirdly, is he alone? Are you? Can either of you expect backup or interruptions? Once these thoughts have crossed your obviously not at all sociopathic mind, you proceed according to your estimates. And voila! This might seem a bit artificially constructed, but this, by all means and purposes, could be considered the power system of real life. Physical strength as a base level of power, the hierarchy of which can be upturned and challenged by technique, martial arts, tools, knives or guns, or interference or support, other people. So in short, we all know and understand what a power system is. So why the overly long explanation? Well, for one, I want this definition down somewhere on my channel, so that I can refer to it in future occurrences. Additionally, I thought this would be a good way to start off a little series I've been planning, in which I go through different power systems in fiction, analyzing and discussing them and their up and downsides. I do not have a name for it yet. Until then, it's just the X as a power system series or some shit like that. And, in order to properly start this off, what series could I talk about other than the object of my eternal fanboyism, My Hero Academia? Before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, I think it's valuable to quickly summarize the origin and the mechanics of MHA's power system. I'll try to be brief. Basically, one day a glowing child is born. Due to what is believed, but not confirmed, to be a widespread genetic mutation following a viral epidemic caused by mice, over the next few generations, more and more newborns begin exhibiting strange powers. Telekinesis, cryomancy, super strength. Over time, the general population becomes saturated with people possessing incredible unique powers. These powers later become known as quirks. Quirks can be pretty much anything, from typical can shoot fire to has a demonic dark spirit living inside of him. These attributes and powers usually manifest in a person in the time between them being born and them turning 4. However, not everyone is born with these powers. Roughly 20% of people are born quirkless. This can be predicted by examining the pinky toe of said person, since the general area of the quirk gene seems to inhabit a space on the chromosomes which is close to another common mutation in which the pinky toe only develops one joint instead of 2. So, since these traits are often inherited together, the toe can be used to predict whether or not a quirk will manifest or not. Should a quirk manifest, it can, as stated, be pretty much anything. Despite this, there are 3 general categories that are commonly used to approximately describe and separate the different types of quirks. The most common type is the emitter type quirk, which is basically just your run-of-the-mill superpower, which can activate at will and will produce, shoot, or emit something. Think of pyromancy and the like. But this definition is quite loose, so you're better off remembering it by their appearance. Emitter types look normal all the time. This will make more sense once we cover the other types. Secondly, we have the transformation type quirk. These powers mainly work by modifying the physical attributes of the user, and in one case the target, to activate the power. This would be where Kirishima and Muscular would fit in. So, in essence, transformation types look weird, but only when using their power. And lastly, we have the mutation type. These quirks are permanent alteration to the human form, which in turn usually enable the user to perform superhuman feats, but not always. Likewise, there is no real turning this quirk off, since their bodies are their quirk. To go back to our shorthand, mutation types look weird all the time. So, now that we have all of this neatly together, there should be one thing about this power system that becomes clear immediately. It is very vague. This is what one would call a soft power system, since the rules and limitations are quite open-ended, thus creating very soft criteria. With all of this laid out, I want to dive into the system and see what makes it work, what issues it faces, and what possibilities it could offer in the future. I then want to end on my conclusion and overall thoughts on it. Naturally, I want to split this video up into 3 segments: the good, the bad, and the future. Starting with the good. Right off the bat, I want to address the big positive aspect of the vagueness in this system. It makes it feel like a way more natural component of this world. A system as vague as this does run into issues we will cover a bit later, but for world-building purposes it works beautifully. Allow me to explain. In real life, we, thanks to science, know a fair bit about the powers and mechanics that govern our reality. Gravity, energy, time, etc. Similarly, we know and understand many aspects of our bodies and biology. But, even so, there are still plenty exceptions and anomalies that our models can't explain. That's due to the man-made nature of scientific models. Nature didn't create physics with any axioms in mind. We humans just built imaginary boxes and plans to fit and categorize what we observed. This inherently means that there will always be inconsistencies and vague areas of any given natural system, since our current models simply can't cover those in a convincing manner yet. And this is where many power systems in fiction stumble a bit. Way too often do they feel like restrictive, 100% clearly defined rule sets rather than a natural energy or occurrence. And if that power system happens to be a man-made one, like techno-magic, then sure, great. But with what are supposed to be natural energies, this creates a dissonance, a weird conflict. These are supposed to be natural, spiritual energies or something like that, which are harnessed by humans. Yet most of the time, they seem almost man-made. Every aspect of them is clearly and conservatively defined, and nothing breaks the rules. Even Hunter x Hunter's Nen, one of the best power systems in fiction, falls victim to this. While its extremely detailed limits and rules work wonders for fight construction and action writing, from a world-building standpoint, they make it a lot harder to accept Nen as just a natural phenomenon. The rules are so strict and not only clearly defined, but also clearly understood by basically everyone using it. So that makes a very constructed and not very natural impression. Enter MHA. It almost seems to take the complete opposite approach to building its power system. Instead of constructing a restricted, clearly defined but obviously artificial rule sets, it opts for one more reminiscent of Bending from Avatar. Lightweight, vague, and easy to understand. This has multiple aspects that all tie into making the system feel more natural. The origin story of Quirks is kept rather murky and is simply, they appeared one day and we don't know why. While in other situations this could be considered a cop-out, in this instance it kinda makes sense. A huge phenomenon like quirks appearing would realistically need a long time to even remotely be understood, let alone its origin. This unknown, added with the fact that different characters and factions within the show seem to have different opinions and theories on how it happened, gives the system a realistic edge that is quite appreciated. Another aspect of this is what some would call the inconsistencies of the system. It is stated in the show that quirks manifest at around age 4, yet present Mike made his parents' ears bleed the first time he cried? Hori, what are you doing? Except, I would not call these inconsistencies as much as realistic inaccuracies. Sure, quirks usually manifest at 4, just like facial hair on males usually starts growing at age 17. Yet I am sure all of you had also that one fucker in early middle school who already had some sick stubble. The point is, with biology, there are of course average times of emergence, but those have to be seen as what they are, averages. There is still a good chance the time frame will be under or overshot. In this context, people developing their quirks at different times makes a lot of sense and adds to the realism of the system. There are a few other factors in this, like how the toe prediction mirrors real-life biogenetical testing, or how people with superpowers were initially called metahumans before society slowly but surely settled with quirks, or how human progress basically stopped for quite a while because the appearance of superpowers naturally caused protest, racism, and conflict. But there is another positive aspect of this system that I would like to highlight here: its implications for characterization. I believe that the big difference between quirks and other fictional superpowers is that quirks are, completely and uniquely, an integral part of the characters which possess them. That might initially sound a bit unimpressive, but really think about what it means for a second. When a person has a quirk, they are, from the youngest age, used to having them. They are a constant part of their days and their lives, and they are only theirs. No one else has the exact same power. Before we delve into the deeper aspects of this, I want to quickly highlight how rare this combination is. In most shows, the powers will be controlled and governed by homogenous energy or force. Think Ki from Dragon Ball or Chakra from Naruto. Very often, these powers are within everyone, but need to be trained and acquired. So, in most cases, a power is the result of training and not there inherently. Additionally, very often, you will see that the kind of power the characters have is not all that dependent on their birth, but more on their preferences. In Naruto, yes, you can be born with or without certain element affinities, but you, through effort, will be able to learn almost all jutsu within your element. By comparison, once you're born with a quirk, that's it. You can strengthen it, you can refine it and alter the way you use it, but that's all. You're stuck with it, whether that be explosive sweat or sticky headballs. And while that can be an issue, it can also be applied wonderfully to characterization, which Horikoshi did and does, by essentially treating quirks as a metaphorical extension of the character. Many of the cast in MHA have personality traits, dreams, issues, and stories that, in some way or another, tie back into their power. Bakugo's arrogance is a result of him being born with an objectively OP power, which earned him a lot of shallow praise. Shinso's disillusionment with the world of heroes stems from his struggle to become one, despite being born with a villainous power. And sometimes this also ties into more serious issues, like mental health. Take Todoroki, for example, with his family abuse. His quirk is quite literally a manifestation of the torn legacy he has to deal with, yet it's also his and his alone. Or, manga spoiler! How about La Brava? Her quirk boosts the power of the person she loves, but for it to work, she needs to be close to that person, know them well and understand them. This led to her developing stalker-like behavior, which in turn caused the people around her to dislike, bully, and avoid her. This then led to her social isolation and almost to her suicide. These examples should show that quirks are designed in such a way that their existence is always a direct influence on the quality and situation of life of the user. It's similar to how in early Naruto he had to deal with the Nine Tails. Only this time, everybody goes through this struggle. A struggle that is simultaneously universal yet unique to each one. This beautifully ties into the themes of social and biological inequality that Hiroaka very often evokes. After all, this is the first sentence we hear in the show.
Here's the sad truth. All men are not created equal.
And you know, it really be like that sometimes. Sometimes you're born with the right power for who you are, and sometimes you are not. And I think Horikoshi deserves credit for creating a power system that is so emblematic of this core idea and theme. But now, it's time to look at the parts of the system that don't work quite as well. Now that we talked at length about the good sides of such a vague system, it's only fair to also mention the negative aspects of this approach. Naturally, keeping a power system vague has one major downside, namely that it creates a way too undefined and murky ground upon which to write the action and fights. Since there are very few general rules as to how quirks work, it's difficult and often unsatisfying trying to predict or imagine matchups, since the system is inherently unpredictable. Therefore, one of the most central aspects of shonen anime, the fights, gets hindered and kinda crippled by this decision in writing. Sure, most of the fights are still fantastic, but that comes mostly from the emotional character writing that is usually placed around those clashes. There are very few fights in Hiroaka that actually have great choreography and creativity behind them. So in essence, the system doesn't facilitate writing action scenes. It doesn't completely make them impossible, but compared to other power systems, quirks are not a definitive solution as how to enable engaging action. Additionally, not every quirk is equally useful. As we mentioned in the positive section, everyone has a unique power that they are stuck with. This severely limits the potential of some characters, once their quirks have been decided. The Minetas of the world can't really compete with Bakugo. Now, this uniqueness to their powers would not have to be a negative. Hirohiko Araki has shown multiple times with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure that it's very possible to create unique abilities that still make for interesting encounters as long as the powers themselves are multifaceted and creative. There is one big difference here though. In JoJo's, only a handful of people actually have these powers, so Araki has more time he can spend on really fleshing them out. In Hiroaka, however, almost everyone has powers, and therefore a much higher density and number of powers is required. Additionally, in order for this world to be believable, there have to be at least some useless powers, since otherwise neither the inequality of birth nor the uniqueness of the powers would really come across as convincing. This concession might work well for world building and characterization, but it also limits the action writing quite severely. Add this with the fact that a quirk can only be trained and improved so much, and you end up with characters that are stuck at the bottom of the metaphorical tier list. Another fundamental flaw of this system can be the lack of an underlying general energy or force. Even with some narrative advantage over those systems like Ki or Chakra, quirks have to deal with an entirely separate problem. There is no real way for these powers to interact. In nen battles or in fights between ninjas, no matter what abilities the fighters have, they are still all using the same energy. Therefore, there are specific ways in which their powers can interact, combine with, or react to each other. With quirks, this simply doesn't work. They're basically all individually working on different mechanics and rules, which eliminates this additional angle of the fights. Now that we have summarized both the good and the bad, I think it's valuable that we look into the future and see what Horikoshi could do to improve or evolve the system. And honestly, there isn't much. At this point, he would have to fundamentally change the way it works, and as we all know, changing essential aspects of a show 200 chapters in is a risky endeavor. Plus, the more I think about the flaws of the system, the more it seems to me that these are not as much oversights on Horikoshi's part and more necessary concessions for the type of story he wants to tell. Every aspect of Quirks seems to be geared towards maximizing its potential for world building while sacrificing action and fights. This makes me believe that these issues are intentional shortcomings that are simply a trade-off for the advantages in the more narrative aspects of the story. So, when looking at Quirks that way, what could Hori do to improve? Well, first of all, I think you should not tinker too much with any essential aspects of the system, at this point at least. Don't, for the love of God, introduce a general quirk energy or some dumb shit like that. Instead, I would very much like him to fuel his creativity into more varied applications and evolutions of the quirks, especially those of the main cast. He has shown that he's willing to improve, and I think it's fair to assume that later down the line, after the inevitable time skip at the latest, we will be getting more creative uses of quirks and so on. It's not like the fights and action scenes are bad as they are now, but they definitely are mostly carried by the character writing as opposed to the action writing. However, both the gentle fight and the high-end fight are good indicators that Horikoshi is improving this aspect of it. I think we're at the point now where we have to accept the idea that MHA is a very different type of shonen. I know we all like to joke about Green Naruto, but it's becoming increasingly clear that this story has vastly different priorities compared to its predecessors and even its contemporaries. Horikoshi seems more concerned with writing a fast-paced teenage character drama with superpowers instead of the usual sequence of action story that we are used to from so many other shonen. Whether or not this approach is better or worse than the other is up to you to decide for yourself, but I think it's fair to say that it has worked out well for MHA so far. I, personally, love this newer approach because it gives the fights inherent meaning and weight when they happen. So I am not too bothered by the fact that this power system is very much built as a narrative tool rather than for construction of action. Overall, I'd say it's solid and achieves what it sets out to, even if that goal is somewhat unorthodox within the battle shonen genre. But what do you think? Agree? Disagree? Curse the unholy soil upon which I was birthed? Let me know. And as always, liking, sharing, and subscribing are greatly appreciated. I'll see you next time. Take care.